insane intro. I don't even know if I'm trying to follow the conversation. This intro so good. How is everybody? That's the energy I like to see. You know, you come to some shows and people are like, yes, we're here, yes, we're here. But no, I like to get a little call and response going. As Sonya mentioned, my name is David Butler, David J. Butler. Some folks know me as Dave Has Wings. I'm a Charlotte artist, photographer, curator, creative consultant. Do a lot of things around the city. And I'm excited to be here to talk with my brother, Stacy Utley, about this beautiful show, In Transition. So everybody just gonna take 2 seconds just to kind of center ourselves in space. Everybody just take a breath in, let it out. Breath in, breath out. One more. Take a deep breath out. Okay. How are you feeling? How is this moment sitting with you right now? We spoke last night, and I got some of the pre-game jitters, and we were kind of getting in line to get things together, but how are you sitting in this very moment? Work on the walls, the room filled, everybody here for you. What are you feeling right now? Hey, everybody. I am very, I think overwhelmed doesn't even do it justice. When you have family that, you know, drives up from Raleigh, when you have college friends that come, when you have coworkers that you haven't seen, current coworkers, and then coworkers you haven't seen in probably 15 years, and just friends and brothers and sisters and everybody being here, it is very, very overwhelming. I think as an artist, you always are trying to put yourself out there and tell a story, and then when you get to see people kind of respond to it, you know, nobody's been kind of cutting their eyes at it, which is cool. But when you see people kind of respond to it and come to you, it's very overwhelming. So I do want to, I want to take this moment to just thank everybody for coming tonight. My students who are here, my family that's here, my friends. Just thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. It means so much. I love you all. Thank you, God. Thank you. So I want to take it. We're going to take it all the way back. We're going to take it back. Okay. When did you know, or when did you see the potential in art being a thing for you? Like when you knew that, like, so we know that you're an architect by trade, right? But when did you know that the art could stand as its own separate thing? And I ask that question because I feel like a lot of times the art is stripped out of us as we get a little older, so you end up doing different things that are kind of adjacent, right? Like you get into, you become a graphic designer, or you become an architect, or you become some of this other thing, because we are socialized to believe that, you know, art isn't profitable, you can't, you know, make it, sustain yourself, et cetera, et cetera. But when did the light bulb go off for you of like, hey, no, my art can be a thing? So I think for me, art has always kind of, it's been part of my DNA, because my father is an artist, my uncle is an artist, and kind of growing up and seeing some of the paintings that he did, and my uncle just kind of drawing, he had an insane comic book collection, and so he would try to draw his own comic books. Those are things that I've always saw, so I don't think I had a choice. I think some way it was going to come out, it was going to manifest itself in some way. I'm kind of one of those people that believe that when God tells you to do something, the good thing is when God tells you to do something, He's not going to leave you alone until you do it. The bad news about it is that when God tells you to do something, He's not going to leave you alone until you do it. So I feel like it was always going to be a thing where my art was going to manifest itself in some way. And so growing up, watching my dad draw, watching my uncles draw, also being in the blessed time where even though, you know, when Good Times was on, you know, even though it was Ernie Barnes, I thought for years it was JJ that did all those paintings. You know, and just seeing images and reflections of myself and my family and my life a little bit through art, I knew it was going to always be a part of me. I didn't know how it was going to turn into this. I don't think I had an idea for it. And I think I strayed away from it for a long time because I was like, I didn't want to be a broke artist, especially when you have a family. And my prayer was, when I started to really pursue my art, is that it becomes a blessing for my family. And so it has been, you know, through my art, I've been able to get them into a good school. Through my art, I was able to get my kids to exposure to things that, you know, I didn't have, what I did have and what I didn't have. And so I think, you know, if you kind of just stay faithful and do what you're being called to do, it will kind of work itself out, and you'll see those steps being ordered in front of you. Definitely. So the earlier, you shared a story with me about some early success you received in art, super early. Can you share that story with everyone about that first mural after winning that contest and kind of what that meant for you and kind of the path that set you on moving forward?
Okay, so when I was in high school, I was the friend who did everybody's projects, you know, when it was required for art. And also when there was an art competition, people were like, hey, join my team. And so there was an art competition for those who are in Raleigh, K97.5. There was a art competition with K97.5 and 7-Up. And for those who are old in here, you remember when 7-Up had that little mascot with the shades and the gloves and everything? So it was this thing where it was 7-Up spot up in the community. And so I did this mural. I did a drawing, and they chose 7 winners, and then we had to paint the mural somewhere downtown. And so one night I was there painting the mural, and the lady who had gotten off work, who got off the bus, she was walking by, and she looked at it, and she was like, did you do that? And I was like, yes, ma'am. She was like, that's good. Do the people know you're supposed to be doing that? She wanted to make sure I wasn't like tagging. And I said, yes, ma'am. And so my parents were there, and she said, well, you know, you're good. You should look at going over to College of Design, that's where I work. And she was a housekeeper over at the College of Design. And so my mom, when she kind of said that, my mom started like kind of doing the research and thought it was a good program to keep me out of trouble to kind of do that camp. And that's how I ended up kind of getting into NC State. And, you know, I think when you have opportunities like that and people kind of come into your life and you never see them again, it's one of those things you have to kind of like really pay attention to. And so that got me into NC State. That also got me an opportunity to meet my mentor, who was Phil Freeline, who did the Harvey Gantt Center and also the African American Museum in DC. And so I just think a lot back on that mural because a lot came out of that mural. And a lot came out of just that woman who thought enough of me to just kind of make that comment to my parents. And you know, I think we got enough.
I want to give a quick shout out and a round of applause rather for mom and dad for taking that initiative as well.
I'll let them know they were here earlier, but I think they're bringing us something to eat.
Gotcha.
They'll come back.
Good thing it's being recorded. We'll send the footage. But no, I mean, a lot of times, not everybody is always blessed to have parents that are going to help them lean into their creative ambitions, let alone find them, you know, be able to align with the industry as well. That's kind of adjacent to that, you know, adjacent to those interests. So from there, you've said that this show is extremely personal to you because of obviously the themes that it touches on, but obviously you've been able to find a way to take your formal training as you know, an architect, and you've been able to meld that into your practice, and we see a lot of that manifested in this show. Could you talk a little bit about that journey of the conflict and the friction between the two, and then how that kind of prepared you to be in a space where, you know, you're now seeing those things start to meld together, and what we see in the show?
Okay. So to talk about that, I have to really start with the beginning, I guess, with my journey as an architect. Like I said, I met Phil Freeline, who ended up being my mentor, and he ended up hiring me as an intern, and I was able to work with him after I graduated. And I remember we were working on a project in South Raleigh. We were trying to do a museum very similar to the Harvey Gantt Center in South Raleigh. And we were having a community engagement session. And so, you know, he was like, this is gonna be your first meeting, you know, you need to come prepared. So I had on my good suit, but I wasn't speaking, I was in the back working the slides. But because I was back there, I heard people in the community talking. And I remember the response from people in the community. They were like, this is gentrification, they're doing it again, they're about to push us out. And I'm like, no, this is crazy. This is, you know, this is Phil Freeline. This is not gentrification. And that was the first time I heard that. And then it was one of those things where I started really kind of paying attention to what was happening in communities. Seeing it like Chavis Heights, Walnut Creek, Halifax Court, seeing those communities that were starting to basically start to push people out and be redeveloped. You know, as an architect for me, I kind of struggled with that because I felt all right, I'm an architect. I'm not trying to gentrify a neighborhood. We're supposed to be building the future, building for, building the community. I struggled with that for a while. And so I felt like, for me, the way to kind of resolve that was, my artwork would speak to the community. Every city has a 20-year plan, but you're talking about from the perspective as an architect or a developer, and you're talking about from the perspective as a Black architect. And a lot of us had conversations about that, when we were coming out of architecture school. Some of us said we would never work for firms that were gentrifying neighborhoods. All of us, there's 7 of us that are still pretty tight today, we all said as Black men we would never work for architect firms that design prisons. And so that was kind of, I don't know if it was shame. I don't know if it was, I don't know if it was shame. I don't know if it was trying to figure out how can I do both and be true to who I am. So I think it's just the fact that it's very layered. Because some of the conversations that we have, people say, if grandma wants to sell that house for that amount of money that she's never seen, who are we to tell her not to? If the family doesn't want it, why shouldn't they sell it? Or they say that change is inevitable. So I think it is a lot of conversations that I had with no real resolution that I could not figure out if I wanted to merge those two together. But I think at some point I think it just happens organically, and I think that's what happened with this series.
No, without a doubt. So we talked about kind of the architectural influence on the work, but I want to talk about, put that MFA to use. I want you to tell me about some of your art-based kind of references, some of your heroes, the people that inspire you, the people that you see your work beside, the people that you didn't want to see. Like, what has that journey been like as you've been continuing to find your voice that we now see in this show?
So, when you start doing mixed media, the first thing you kind of hear, especially in the Charlotte area, you hear Romeo Bearden. And I tried hard not to do collage work that was based off of Romeo Bearden's work. I didn't say, oh, it looks just like Romeo Bearden. I'm not Romeo Bearden. But at some point I was like, let me just dive into it and see what happens. I think once you kind of go through something, you find things on the other side of it. And so that particular piece over there is called The Block Now. And it really is based off of Bearden's piece that he did in the early 70s called The Block. And it was kind of like his love letter to Harlem. And I actually did that as a collage first. A good friend of mine owns that piece now. But I wanted to take it and see what happens if I take the block that Bearden did and gentrify that block. What does the block look like now? And so that piece, I will say, really is inspired by Bearden's work. Another thing that I don't think I really talked about in terms of the color palette, I hear a lot of people say, oh, I love the colors really pop, the colors really, they kind of draw me in. The color palette is inspired by redlining maps. And so if you've ever been to Charlotte Museum of the New South, they had Charlotte's redlining maps up there. And the redlining maps, if you notice, it's coded. Red means the hazardous areas, the areas that are in decline. Yellow also means that those areas they're on their way to decline. And then the turquoise kind of green areas mean these are the areas that are still desirable. And so that's how you kind of start seeing those things kind of translate in the work. Because I wanted to use a simple color palette that kind of was kind of coding things, and when you start saying that, people start seeing some of the businesses saying, now closed, or we've moved, or for sale. So you start seeing those other things that are happening, or people that are actually packing up and moving out, and those who are moving in. And so that, I want to say, I was inspired basically by just looking at the redlining, and then also maybe some of Jacob Lawrence's work, because he used bold colors as well. The other artist that I really loved was Aaron Douglas. Aaron Douglas, he was one of the artists, I loved how he did his buildings, because his work was based off of the Great Migration, and how the cities up north were seen like the shining cities on the hill, the cities of opportunities. But once people moved up north, they were still dealing with slum areas. They were still dealing with those hazardous areas. So those, I think, at the end of the day, were 3 artists that really kind of inspired. I think I kind of like referenced their work a little bit in terms of wanting to create a narrative.
Gotcha. Is there an architectural reference in terms of specific cities that some of these are based off of? Were you thinking about specific cities or specific architectural elements that you see in different geographic areas?
So some people, it's funny, people are like, is that Baltimore? Is that New York? Oh, this is Charlotte. That looks like, that looks like that looks like this neighborhood. That looks like that neighborhood. That looks like my neighborhood. my thesis initially, the photography piece was called Any City America. Because it's really happening in any city of America. It is happening in Baltimore, it's happening in Chicago, in San Francisco, in New York, or New York, Harlem, Brooklyn, or the New Brooklyn. It's happening in all those areas. So there's no specific city. I want you to look at it and see how it resonates to you.
And I also would encourage everyone to actually look up those maps, because there's a database that allows for you to see it for every single city, every major city in the country. We referenced those maps in 2018 when we did Welcome to Brook Hill at the Gantt Center with Alan C. Jacobs. I was exhibition designer and co-curator of that show as well. So that has been a large resource as Charlotte has continued to grapple with this growth and development. There's been referenced in several contexts, so it's beautiful to see it the way that it showed up here, and you've done a great job of continuing to encourage the dialogue, but really moving it into the work in a very, very specific way. Getting into more of the kind of the details of the body of the work, and you were talking about how some folks are being packing up and moving. I also noticed that those were kind of the figures that were given some of the expression. You can see the expression, as in the other figures are kind of they're placed there for narrative's sake, but these figures in this large piece to our right, you can see the expression as they're carrying these boxes. How do you decide when you're gonna go to that level of detail, or is it what's your thought process when it comes to using figures placed for narrative specific pieces, and when you're gonna lean into more of those elements of getting to really a lot of your roots of childhood, drawing, cartooning, those kinds of things that you were saying, comic books and things like that. Those references are kind of showing up there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when it comes to the expression, one thing that plays into it is the scale of the piece. The other thing is that I think back to when I was having conversations with those people in the community. One lady, the lady that I talked to initially, she was like, she's been telling the owner, because she was renting, and if he was decided to sell, she would not get the notification or offers to sell because she's not paying taxes on the house. It would go to the owner. And she would always say, listen, if you're gonna sell, please give me enough time to know, because I have to find a neighborhood with a good school. I gotta figure out how I'm gonna get my child to school. I'm gonna figure out how I'm gonna get him to school, but get to work. I need to figure out, just transportation, just basic transportation issues. There were people that were saying, and particularly with this one right here, that one is in Cherry. I was talking to the lady across the street. She was like, I just talked to my neighbors three weeks ago. They said nothing about moving. And now here's a bulldozer tearing down their house. So it's hearing those stories and having to think about what to do. I don't know if any of us have been in that position where we got to figure out what we got to do, what we got to move our families, what we can afford, because we can't afford nothing these days. Inside in uptown, that's a lot of stress. That is a lot of stress, and so I was thinking about that in terms of the scale of the piece, and really wanted to show that in terms of seeing that on people's faces. And then there's another documentary called I Used to Live Here that I watched, and I will never forget it was a lady who was an artist. She was an older lady, and she said it was my community until they welcomed me to it. So it's funny, when you live in these neighborhoods and all of it says, welcome to this area, welcome to that area, and it's like, I live here, why are you welcoming me to my community? And so just hearing the expressions on that, I think that's when I decided I wanted to kind of incorporate that into the figures.
I'm curious to, as you talked about the color palette, and how could you go into how some of the color palette and the structures work together throughout the series? You kind of have alluded to, and kind of shown we see cranes. The cranes are in that turquoise color,
the same blue, yeah.
Perceived to be desirable. Could you talk about how that shows up throughout the series as well?
Yeah, I mean, really when I started, I knew I wanted to start with the red brick buildings because it reminds us of so many communities that we can think of. For those of us in Raleigh, Chavis Heights, from those from Chicago, Cabrini Green, just different neighborhoods. I wanted to start with the red. And it's interesting because people, when they look at that, they say, I still see a sense of community, and I still see people kind of gathering together. And I want to be clear, even though this is a hard situation, a hard conversation, and these neighborhoods were, they were lacking some of the basic necessities and things they needed, you were still able to produce doctors and lawyers and preachers and teachers in spite of the circumstances they were in. So that sense of community is what held communities together. So I wanted to make sure that the red was vibrant, even though it had a dual meaning. So I wanted the red to kind of really do that. I wanted the yellow to kind of be a way of like a transitional color, if you will. It's in some buildings, but mostly it's the skies in a lot of them. And then I also wanted the green to be very stark in terms of this is what's new and this is what is desirable in these communities. And so I wanted there to be not so much a complete distinction between one color, the red and the turquoise. I wanted it to kind of be a subtle transition to both of them.
You seem to be able to kind of create your own world in a sense, with the way that, you know, you've been able to kind of put a narrative to these specific. What comes to mind when you think about, you know, the world that these pieces may exist in, like the world that it represents? Is it something that you see is very, obviously it's attached to our stories, we're living and seeing it now, but is it, when you're creating it, is it something where you feel like you're immersed in this space? Is it something that's representative of, you know, something, another place in your mind? Like where does that exist?
It really depends on the piece. I think if I had to give an overarching theme or feeling about it, it's a conversation that I'm continuing to have, and that conversation changes with the people I'm talking to. In terms of the certain questions that I ask, it could be those who live in those neighborhoods, that's a conversation. It could be architects and developers, that's a conversation. It could be those people in the neighborhood, you know, that live in those communities and the developers together, that's a whole conversation. It's a dialogue. And so I think it really just depends on the piece that I'm working on. You know, this particular piece right here, where it has, you know, it has big box on there, because think about Plaza Midwood. You think about the mom and pop shops that are being shut down. The small restaurants that we all loved and went to that we can are no longer there. I think about that. When I think about this right here, I think about food deserts, where you have people, if you look close enough, you see all the people that are in that red zone. They are carrying bags, which means they have to walk somewhere else or catch public transportation somewhere else to get food. That's the space that I was in. It could have been music that I was listening to or a podcast that I was listening to that kind of helped inform what it looks and shapes like. The pieces that are behind on the wall back there, honestly, that piece, I had ideas about what I wanted to do, but it was a day that I actually kind of walked through Brook Hill. Because that's what really inspired the colors of those houses, and thinking about how those homes are being dwarfed by new buildings.
Expound on this as well, like talking about like, this feels like jazz to me. Like, you know what I mean? A lot of the work feels very, like, it just gives me that emotion in the same way as when I'm listening to Miles Davis or, you know, Herbie Hancock or somebody like that. Could you talk about your experience, how your experience and where, you know, earlier in your work we talked about how like, obviously Black life, you started out just kind of shaping your work around that. It was like what you saw, it was kind of what was expected from that early time. And now you're showing a specific part of Black experience. Could you talk about how, you know, Black life and Black experience shows up in your work now, and what those influences are? Is it jazz music? Is it, you know, strictly where we are in this moment as it relates to gentrification? What are those things that are influencing you now to create the work and tell your stories?
I think
from Black life specifically.
You know, I think for me, I think as an artist, I think you bring everything that you've experienced, all your experiences somehow show up in your work. When I first kind of started out wanting to be an artist, I was painting everything that I kind of knew and see. I was painting the barbershops, the salons, the churches. I was painting things that I saw that were on TV. You know, of course, knowing that David Driscoll was somebody who helped select the artists for the set of The Cosby Show. You know, those were all things that I see that I kind of identify with. And it's funny, I listen to music a lot too when I'm doing my work. So it's funny that you mentioned jazz, because there, you know, I do hear certain songs when I am listening to when I'm creating. That's really interesting that you said that. So I have to sit with that for a minute, because those who know me know I love music, and I do listen to a lot of jazz. Nancy Wilson, Cannonball Adderley. I don't know, that, you kind of threw me off with that one. Sorry.
that's one of those divine connection moments.
And I don't think I mentioned that yesterday.
No, we didn't talk about music at all. Well, honestly, part of it is too. You know, I talked to Sonya about this as well. But as a part of my practice, because I run a marketing agency full time, and I don't always have the opportunity to kind of sit and create. And also, I'm a photographer, so a lot of my work comes from my archive. I work with puzzles now and all that kind of stuff. But For me, if I have a creative concept, the first thing I do is build a playlist. So the first thing I do is I build a playlist of songs that fit into the energy or the ethos that I want to come out of the idea. And I listen and kind of meditate on that playlist for weeks and months at a time. And then when I'm like not thinking about anything at all, the idea or the concept comes full story. I know exactly what picture I need to go pull. I know exactly what, which puzzle shape I want to turn it into. I know exactly what the narrative is, but it all comes from that ethos of allowing the subconscious to do the work. Like I'm just making deposits into the subconscious intentionally, knowing that it will come to the forefront.
And that's crazy how that works as artists, as we do that, because I don't know if I necessarily make a playlist, but there is certain songs that I want to listen to, or certain. I do have like a lot of playlists, but it's either that or podcasts. I love listening to interviews and certain conversations, and so that, I guess subconsciously I do that a lot. I do listen to a lot of music, a lot of jazz, a lot of early hip hop, especially a lot of early hip hop. Not today's hip hop. Nothing against today's hip hop. But I know, man, the tone in that. I mean, just saying. For young people. But 90, 92, so yeah. But I do listen to a lot of music because it does kind of, I guess, put me in a certain headspace while I'm creating. And it's one of those things where it's funny. I knew as an architect there were a lot of late nights where I was like, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot stay up to 2 o'clock in the morning doing red lines and doing shop drawings. But I can stay up to 6 a.m. painting, listening to music, and just kind of going down that rabbit hole. And sometimes I do, and sometimes when I get in a good groove, I'm painting and I'm drawing, I'm listening to music, and I'm texting my friends, sending them pictures of it. I apologize, because sometimes it's like 5 a.m. in the morning. But you kind of find that space, man, when you kind of get into it. And I think you kind of just let it move you. You kind of just let it move you, and you see what you come up with. Some things you come up with, it's great. Some things you're like, I'll put it off to the side till later on. But if it's something of value, you always come back to it.
Speaking of, because I know we talked about this before too, I think it was in one of the pre-conversations, but there are some pieces in here that, predate the rest of the collection, right? Like some of these are like seeds planted 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Talk about that process, or if you feel like pointing out specific pieces, or if you want to challenge people to figure it out. But I want you to talk about how, it's not a linear process. Like we don't know, we're creating something and something that'll sit in storage, or you'll paint over something. Like talk about that for you in this body of work.
This particular piece right here, Covenant, that piece I think I started, it was probably 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And the farthest I got on that, I painted the whole background black, and I did the five houses. And I just couldn't figure out what to do with it. I don't know if it was the space that I was in, mentally or physically. I could not finish it. And I did throw it away, probably because I spent a lot of money on that paper. But I rolled it up. I had a Studio 8 gig year. I remember I was working on it there. I didn't finish it there. I put all my stuff in storage. It sat there in storage. I moved into the Vapa Center uptown back in, a year ago, 2 years ago at this point. And it sat in my storage unit there, and I didn't know what to do with it. I guess during that time frame, I started kind of finding my voice, and then this started to make sense, and I was like, that's what I need to do with it. I need to tell the story. I need to tell the story of what that means. And it's crazy because, you know something, I always say art is like real estate. It will hold its value. It will hold its value, and you just have to kind of be patient with it. And so it stayed rolled up, and I remember texting Morgan, because they were going through the final process of the show, selecting the works, and I was like, I got one more piece, it's not done yet. And she was like, okay, the show's in a couple of weeks. And I literally brought the piece home, and I remember staying up, and I was just going at it, and in about maybe 2 to 3 days, I did that piece. But it's like when you kind of find that feeling, you find that groove, and that's what you want to do, man, you gotta go with it. You gotta trust your gut. And so that was a particular piece. That one over there, like I said before, that one is like a part 2, because the one that I did before, I wasn't feeling it. I felt like it had a value to it, but I knew it wasn't done, and I couldn't figure out why. But now I feel like it's accessible because of the body of work that's done here. So I think the thing is that, you have to kind of trust your senses, and then, when a piece is not done, set it aside, give it time, give yourself time to like kind of come back to it. And then when you do, you're able to create something that's a little bit more meaningful, a little bit more impactful. And then there's a story to it. There's a story to it. So, it's crazy to look at it and see it now. I was like, wow, okay. I started, I think, 5 years ago. That thing traveled. But, now it makes sense, and I'm happy with the outcome of it.
For sure. So, obviously, art is subjective, it's open to the interpretation of the viewer. But if there is and this is a very, very layered and nuanced body of work with, to your point, all of the layers and conversations, what is your statement, if you will, that you want people to be able to take away from this work, because the conversations are so nuanced and can go in so many different directions, and it comes down to the agency, or there being no agency for a lot of the people that are a part of these stories. What is it that you wish to communicate through this body of work, through your practice going forward?
At the end of the day, it's about dialogue, it's about conversation. I think in the work that I've done over the last couple of years, being able to work with the community, I think what anybody wants to hear or wants to feel, they want to feel like they've been heard. Communities are hurting and they want to feel like they're being heard. And so I think some way in the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to give voice to those who feel like they don't have a voice. I'm trying to give a face to those who feel like they're not seen. I am trying to also communicate the fact that it's a conversation that's ongoing. This is something that's going on ongoing, and we need to kind of keep having that conversation and working with the community who wants just the basic needs and should have the basic needs and should not get them when the demographic of the community is starting to change. And so I think that is something that I would want people to kind of walk away in terms of having that conversation. It's been awesome tonight to talk to so many different people who could share their stories personally about neighborhoods that they lived in, or their grandparents lived in, or that they're familiar with, and really being able to see that. And so I like the fact that it's kind of created that dialogue, and I think that dialogue needs to kind of continue on with multiple people across the table.
I appreciate it as a Charlotte native, and someone who is, I literally tell people, when I left for college in 2009 and came back in 2013, it was literally a different skyline. So that was the time that the Duke Energy building went up. So when I left, the focal point was Bank of America building. When I came back, the Duke Energy building was built and it had lights, and it was completely different. It was a different city. So the fact that there is so much conversation, and this is continuing to push that dialogue forward for people to think about what spaces were prior to you being there, or what you being in a space means and could mean for the people who were there prior to, is extremely important, and we appreciate you for doing that work. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw
Yep.
some.
Yeah.
Sure thing.
Thoroughly enjoyed the talk. Quick question, Stacy. Met a wonderful Chicago artist, retired architect, and he mentioned to me that when he was in architectural school in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, they were required to take art classes and watercolor classes. Was that one of the requirements that you had while you were in school?
No, it wasn't. When I was in school, it was drafting boards, T-squares, and triangles. And so that was basically how you did your drawings. What I really loved about architecture, I found myself being drawn to those who do renderings, because I felt like you were kind of activating those spaces and you were kind of bringing those spaces to life. So I always wanted to be the person who did the renderings. And I can't say that that was something that was in the curriculum for architecture. You could take it as an additional course if you wanted to. It was not encouraged when I was there. But I always found myself kind of like linking up with those who were really good at that at the firms that I worked for. There was one artist, I think his name is Chris Abbott. He worked for Perkins and Will in Dallas. And his stuff was amazing. But it was a final product of it. And so I feel like some of that is kind of in my work. But it's not the final product of a space, it's kind of a space in transition. And so what happens when you kind of capture that influx moment of new structure being built and people being forced out and moved out and people moving in. So But, you know, I definitely always admired those who did that, and I always kind of looked at their work, but it was not part of the career.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Guess you guys covered it all. All right, now thank you to Dave Butler for moderating too.